Dear colleagues, when you were looking at the sheet in preparation for this session, you probably scrolled down and you probably saw the title of my speech and you probably thought, oh no, what a depressing speech. Somebody is going to talk about fear, anxiety, and stress. Or you may have thought, well, that's kind of a weird topic for a speech. Why isn't she picking something relating to geopolitics or what's going on in the world right now? Why has she chosen to talk about fear and anxiety? And anyway, who wants to hear about fear and anxiety? However, I promise that this will not be a depressing speech. Essentially, what I want to try and do is analyze what happens to our minds and our bodies when we are scared, when we're anxious, and when we're stressed. And the idea is basically to demystify these sensations. The idea is to demystify what happens so that we will get less overwhelmed and so that we will understand what's happening to our bodies and our minds when we are scared or anxious. So first of all, it might be good to have a look at some of the differences and similarities between the three emotions that I mentioned: fear, anxiety, and stress. Let's start with the differences first of all. So stress is a temporary short-term response. Think of maybe having a work deadline, for example, or having a fight with your spouse or your partner. That's an example of a temporary short-term response to an unpleasant event, let's say. However, stress can actually be a long-term response as well. It can be a long-term response to prolonged periods where you may have too much on your plate, quite simply, or where you are exposed to unpleasant events on a regular basis. Anxiety, however, is different. Anxiety is persistent, excessive worrying, essentially. It's generally a response which doesn't go away. It can be short-term or long-term. And sometimes stressors, so factors which cause stress, don't even have to be present for you to feel anxiety. And we've all experienced anxiety. It's that little monster haunting you in the back of your head. It can be in the background or even in the foreground, but it tends to be persistent. Fear, well, you may associate fear with things like spiders, for example. You may associate fear with scary movies or something like that. But on a more serious note, other forms of fear are also very common and legitimate. You may be scared of failure. You may be scared of losing your job. All of those things are really legitimate. And fear often arises from a perceived threat. So the threat of harm, whether that is real or imagined. And it's this that makes us flee from danger, whether the danger is perceived or real. So we've just had a preliminary look at these three emotions in quite a superficial way. So let's have a look at the similarities. Often we tend to confuse fear, stress, and anxiety because these sensations often prompt the same physiological response or responses. So in all three cases, you may experience your heart beating very fast, you may feel nauseous or sick, you may have a tight feeling in your stomach or your chest, you may start trembling, you may get sweaty, and you may be just simply unable to enjoy other things that you may otherwise have enjoyed. And that often happens in the case of those three emotions. And often we don't identify these emotions for what they are. We're not aware that we're struggling with them until we go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, your blood pressure is quite high, or your recent loss of appetite is actually due to stress or anxiety. We often don't realize these things until the doctor actually points it out to us. But these emotions and these responses are all linked to, stress, anxiety, and fear. But we often associate these physiological responses with fear rather than with anxiety or stress, which is why they often pass unnoticed. We often think, well, those responses, the responses that I just mentioned, the heart beating fast, feeling nauseous, those responses are linked to fear and not to stress and anxiety. And hey, I'm not scared. My life isn't at risk at this present moment. Why would I be scared? So I'm not feeling what I think I'm feeling, which is why we often disregard those physiological responses or simply, yeah, ignore them. But as I said, these same responses often emerge when we're anxious and stressed as well as scared. And this is especially the case if we go for prolonged periods of time where we're feeling those emotions. What's interesting, however, is that a lot of psychiatrists have actually broken down emotions into 3 categories. And I'd just like to spend a bit of time talking about these 3 categories of emotions. First of all, according to psychiatrists, you have your core emotions. And those emotions tend to be things like joy, anger, sadness, excitement, and of course, fear. And these are the physical sensations that we come to recognize and name as emotions. So they're quite easy to categorize as emotions because we know what they are. And these sensations inform us of our environment. So are we safe? Are we hurt? Are we happy? These emotions allow us to respond to those questions. And these emotions are hardwired in us. They are not subject to conscious control. For example, they really are triggered by our environment. But our bodies and our brains are pre-wired to set off a host of physiological reactions that prepare us for an action that's meant to be adaptive. For example, running away from danger. And this is where you get the typical flight or fight response. These emotions really shouldn't be blocked. As much as we may like to inhibit these emotions, as much as we may try to, that's actually really unhealthy. If we do not block these emotions, they can actually help us to thrive and even survive. For example, think of the case of a car coming towards you at 100 miles per hour. You've got to get out of the way really quickly. And it's that fear that allows you to do that. So that's the example of a core emotion helping you to survive. The second block of emotions is the inhibitory emotion block. Inhibitory emotions actually block core emotions. And these inhibitory emotions are things like shame, anxiety, and guilt. Often when core emotions become just too intense and too overwhelming, our brain wants to shut them down in order to protect us from being emotionally overwhelmed. And that's when you get the inhibitory emotions. Then the third block of emotions are your defenses. And these are the things that we do to avoid feeling core emotions and inhibitory emotions. So an example of this would be depression. Depression often seeks to put people out of touch with their core emotions. It seeks to distance them from their core emotions. And there are many examples of this. For example, even things like having too much screen time, procrastination, overworking, over or under eating, for example, addictions. These are all examples of things that we may do that are aimed at preventing us from feeling these core emotions or inhibitory emotions, which may be quite painful. And many psychologists espouse the idea of the change triangle. And the change triangle is a really interesting idea. The idea basically is to help people determine where they are on this spectrum, if they're feeling core emotions, inhibitory emotions, or defenses. So the idea is to help people to put themselves on that spectrum and then help them to determine where they want to go and how to get there. Usually you want to get to the point where you're feeling core emotions and where you're not feeling inhibitory emotions or defenses, for example. So to come back to the original idea that I put forward at the start of the speech, fear is one of those 7 core emotions, and that's the sensation which makes us flee from danger. Anxiety is the example of an inhibitory emotion, and that results from avoiding core emotions and core needs. And actually, anxiety often results from efforts to push down and repress those are the core emotions. Often we're not in physical danger, but we are experiencing something akin to fear when we experience anxiety. In the case of fear, your five senses tend to be very awakened. Think of, for example, a fire happening in your house at night. All of your senses will be awakened. You will be able to smell the smoke, you'll be able to see the flames, you'll be able to hear the crackling, and that fear will prompt a response in your body to get out of the house. And without fear, actually, human beings will be really easy prey. Fear is a really integral part uh, of our body's response to certain stimuli. For example, it's a job of our brain to prepare our body for the fight and flight response. So changes have to happen in our body in response to dangerous stimuli. For example, a fire happening in your house at night. In the case of anxiety, the feelings and sensations may be similar, but the background situation is very different. And in a way, anxiety is actually the opposite of fear, because fear mobilizes our energy, whereas anxiety pushes it back down. Which is why often if you're experiencing depression, you are very low on energy and you struggle to get out of bed because that's your body producing a response which crushes that energy that you might otherwise have. So it can be very confusing because we can experience something very like fear, which is actually anxiety. And this is why it's very easy to confuse the two. But to come back to fear, fear is actually related to natural responses in our body. And it goes back to when human beings lived in hunter-gatherer societies. They needed this response because they needed to either flee from dangerous animals, from wild animals, or they needed to fight intruders or enemies, for example. And their fear did a really good job in helping them to survive, basically. So just by way of conclusion, just a few ideas for dealing with fear, stress, and anxiety. And again, these are not my own ideas because I would not presume to be an expert on this in any way, shape, or form. But psychiatrists often say that it's helpful to take a step back and to identify how your body's responding and which kind of emotions it's experiencing. And then they say that it's a good idea to come up with an action plan. Often people say that naming their fears is very helpful. Naming their fear or their anxiety or their stress for what it is important. And then it's important to give those fears or that anxiety space in your mind. And that's especially important for anxiety because anxiety can often be this diffuse, vague, elusive sense of apprehension, which is very hard to categorize. So naming your fears and anxiety for what they are is very important, especially as anxiety often comes with suppression as well. So it's important to categorize your fears and to give them space. And the idea behind this is that if you do that, what you're feeling will cease to be this scary black cloud which is hanging over you. It will cease to be this lump of uncertainty. You'll start to actually understand it and recognize it for what it is. And with that certainty comes an ability to deal with the fear. So just in conclusion, another idea which I think is quite interesting is the idea of the monster under the bed. And you're probably wondering what on earth I'm talking about. But think about it. Quite often children are scared of monsters lurking under their bed. And they check under their bed and they keep checking under their bed to make sure that there's no monster there to hurt them while they're sleeping. And actually, I find this idea very helpful, even if it is quite abstract, because often we feel like bad things in our lives are lurking like a monster, waiting to pounce on us at a moment's notice. And we need that reassurance, like a child needing to check under their bed to check that there's no monster. But sometimes it's helpful to remind ourselves that that's all those fears are. That's all they are. They're just monsters, fake imagined monsters lurking under our bed. That's not to say that they're not legitimate, but often the things that we fear are as imagined as those monsters under our beds, and they don't have any power to hurt us. And when we realize that those fears have no power to hurt us, they are monsters that we can then get rid of. They are demons that we can exorcise. So I hope that you found that interesting, and I will stop there now. And yeah, hope you found it interesting, and we can come back for the second speech in a bit.